Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone following this video recording of my presentation. My name is Maya Sahajic. I'm from the University of Antwerp, and today I'm going to share some of my thoughts on the best practices on federalism and on the stabilization of multi-level systems with regards to some of the European experiences. I'm going to start with an introductory slide, which actually has two kind of, well, not exactly hypotheses, but there are two different claims. And one claim is that at this point in time, we are seeing an oversimplified link between territory and identity. And the other one upon which we're going to build the rest of this presentation is that there is a shift from unitary nation states towards heterogeneous decentralized systems, which actually causes a lot of different effects, at least when we talk about systems with federal arrangements. In reality, what we see is that contemporary insights actually prove us that the territorial reconfiguration is associated with the identity. And but at the same time, we also know that in heterogeneous decentralized systems, the link between territory and identity is actually shifted from a general form of identity, such as, for example, citizenry or nation, towards groups that have specific identity markers. And if we're looking into the autonomy claims and if we're looking into differences in ethnicity, language, religion, or culture, in general, differences in identity, then we see that those differences actually put into sharper perspective changes in the original territorial demarcation. And this is where the idea of ethnogeography maybe can explain the role of identity in territorial conflicts. It certainly looks closely into conception of territory under the influence of identity markers, and explains that ethnic groups or different types of groups that have identity differences, they accumulate their territorial rights through their land use practices, sort of to say. And this also implies that that the conceptions of territory could be also a societal product, and they kind of change as specific groups actually change their understanding of their position within a specific territory. But to legitimize their understandings, territorial communities then claim their shared values and therefore their collective identity. And this way, the territory actually reflects the cultural, historical, sociological identity of the people, of the population that is actually living there. So identity and territory are difficult, if not impossible, to disconnect because they have a very close connection. The second circle that I made here on this slide, I'm going to develop further on. So I'm going to delve into the next slide. Why is it important to talk about a theoretical split? Because, as I mentioned, this previous slide is actually just an introductory note to what I'm going to talk about today. In our traditional understanding of states with federal arrangements, the way I like to call them, we actually see that federal state is a state that is a compound of equal constituent units, and those equal constituent units actually have a kind of a very equal mutual status among them. Generally and historically also, a federal state used to be considered only as an alternative to a unitary state. And the only federal states that are considered to be acceptable ones used to be model federal systems, model federations, such as, for example, the United States or Germany and so on. Traditionally, we also consider, of course, theoretically, we consider that mononational states are the only ones that are acceptable for the fact that multinationalism always underlies some disputes, and that multinationalism is always there to challenge the stability of the state, of the system. But in contemporary setting, we also see more and more fragmented systems. We see them everywhere. But we also see that we use some federal features to accommodate differences even there when we cannot really see the federal state itself. And a lot of states today actually embrace multinationalism. And that is important. Why all of this is important? Because on the basis of this, we actually see the actual split between the traditional and contemporary federal theory. So under traditional terms, we see the federal state, as I said, as a compound of equal component states, and those states actually have identical status among them. And it is important that if there would be any type of difference among them, then it is likely that the centralization would be the key to solving that problem. The mononationalism is also kind of that's a concept that builds upon nation building as well. And this is also linked to loyalty and other concepts that can provide something homogeneous in terms of the population that lives in a specific territory. And then we have very symmetrical, and that goes towards equality of federal of the component states. We have symmetry, and symmetry is integrative mechanism, and it serves to provide more unity and more harmony. On the other side, we actually see a pushback towards the traditional federal theory. We see that contemporary federal theory recognizes that many systems are multi-tiered, if not federal, purely federal, because we see that there are variations in status among component states, well, if not component states, that at least among subnational entities, cantons, regions, whatever we want to call them. We also recognize multinationalism. Well, multinationalism not necessarily as multinationalism per se, but anything that can evoke the sense of identity differences, because diversity becomes very significant, and it emphasizes actually the quality of difference. And in this way, we see that asymmetry is actually natural. It is implied that it will be there, because there would be variations, there would be identity differences. So the relationships between, for example, territorially embedded differences necessarily could be implied. So what we see is actually what I saw, the difference between ideal and what we see in reality. This brings me to what I call the swinging moods of federalism, because to accommodate differences, we actually have to start with the tensions. And the tensions actually start if there are some identity differences, if there are some identities that have not been recognized, and then they have important political message to send. They claim autonomy, and in order to accommodate those identities, a specific system or a specific state embarks in the process of federalizing and then accommodates the differences. And this is why we actually have federal arrangements not only in federal states, but we also have them in something that we call non-federal states in general. So non-federal states would be, the states normally people do not designate, for example, Spain or Italy as non-federal states. But also we see federal arrangements, as I said, in unitary states. There are always federal principles that we can apply in any type of state. And also this brings us to the concept, for example, of dynamic federalism, which is popularized by Patricia Popoli, also from the University of Antwerp, my dear colleague, who presented a gliding scale of different types of states, different types of systems. And we see that starting from unitary regionalists towards the confederalists, we can, in any type of system, we can put federal principles, we can apply some federal tools, mechanisms, instruments, and we can use it for conflict accommodation. And as I said, we see it even in unitary states. Some will say, for example, Indonesia or Italy or Spain even. Spain or the UK in contemporary federal setting is definitely not a unitary state, but at the same time, we have scholars who still respect the traditional division on unitary federal and confederal. So, and then we also have regionalists. As I said, Italy in contemporary setting would be, for example, a regionalist state, and then federalists. Of course, I'm talking only in, for example, at this point in the European terms, federalists would be Germany or Austria, supranational European Union, and confederalists, and so on. There are ways how we actually use federal principles to accommodate specific differences or conflicts. And here we actually see that the gliding scale provides us with something which actually designates a shift at the same time, because the gliding scale shows us that it is not really necessary to delineate state systems. We do not have to divide them into unitary, federal, and confederal, or even unitary regionalist towards confederal. We can just use federal principles and apply them where necessary in order to accommodate conflict. And this is in line with the shift that is happening in terms of the constant search for autonomy. And this constant search for autonomy, as I said, is linked to identity differences, such as, for example, identity differences in Belgium, identity differences in Spain, in the UK, and so on. And it's necessarily, maybe that's a strong word, but obviously on many occasions, the constant search for autonomy ends up in bringing up tiers of government between the central and the local level. And then we talk about subnational entities. We also see how identity is very much important because it brings us this idea of individuality among different types of belongings because it is necessarily linked to the accommodation of it. And it depends really on how intensive the demands for the accommodation identity are. It really depends on what kind of how does it end up, and will it end up in establishing some kind of a differentiated pattern or asymmetrical system? And then, as I said, multinationalism in terms of identity differences is very much important, because we are talking about differences that are built upon ethnic, cultural, religious, or any other types of differences. When we are talking about significant groups that have, usually it's one type of identity, but it can be more types of identity, claim their political autonomy around this identity. And when this claim, when this intensity for the claim is very much strong enough, it will necessarily end up in another tier of government, and it will end up in establishing embedded, territorially embedded identity. Which brings me to constitutional asymmetry as a concept, because if we bring up multiple tiers of government based on those identities, we necessarily talk about constitutional asymmetry. We have empirical evidence for that. In my latest book, I've proved that constitutional asymmetries are linked strictly to multinationalism. It happens, constitutional asymmetry actually happens when we have an unequal positioning of specific subnational entities, regions, cantons, states under the law. The fact is that we also talk about component units of any kind. So we're talking, as I said, about, it can be canton, it can be Länder. We're talking about, if we're talking about Germany, it can be regions, if we're talking about Italy, and so on. The fact is that the component units within one constitutional system do not have a uniform relationship among each other. But not only among each other, their relationship towards the central level is normally also differentiated. One thing that is important also is that constitutional asymmetry actually is based on political asymmetry, or the relationships that are based on, for example, ethnic, cultural, religious, linguistic, or any other types of identity differences. Once, when those differences, when those political asymmetries are constitutionally embedded or legally embedded, it is then that we are talking about the proper constitutional asymmetry. And now we see the actual examples. This brings me to the actual European examples of constitutional asymmetries as alternatives. I'm not going to start with European Union, maybe because I'm going to talk about, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And for example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have the Dayton Peace Agreement, which settled the territorial claims between three ethnic national communities. These three ethnic national communities, three constituent peoples, Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs, actually split the internal territorial structure in order to accommodate their own claims, which actually produced a lot of differences in terms of the status, powers, and competences. Not so much fiscal autonomy, but it used to happen. It used to be like that before, but it's not anymore. In Italy, we also see how identity in terms of, for example, special regions, especially South Tyrol, which are based on specific historic and ethnic and linguistic distinctions, are actually tied into territorial claims, and they also have differences, as I said, in status, They have differences in powers and competences, differences in fiscal autonomy, especially, for example, when we talk about the South Tyrol. Belgium is a system that is under the constant state reform, following the sequence of state reforms. We call it dyadic federalism here in Belgium because it encompasses two large separate linguistic communities, one very small German, so we have French and Dutch-speaking community, and then there is small, not community as such, but there is a small language group, German language group, also inhabiting the Belgium. And also we have regions which are sometimes overlapping and sometimes not overlapping with the communities, depending on whether we're talking about, for example, about Wallonia or Flanders. This is kind of initiated with the onset of the economic development in Flanders, which created a lot of tension, a lot of friction between communities and regions. In Spain, we also have the term nation, which refers to four main identities, such as Spanish, Basque, Catalan, and so on. But they're constantly competing with the Spanish national identity, and they also have special status. They're also very much emphasized autonomy claims, especially when we talk about historic nationality status in terms of, for example, distinctive language, distinctive special civil rights, and so on. And finally, the United Kingdom, well, literally every single part, except for England, which is not necessarily a subnational entity. So we see some autonomy claims, we see the historical status because of the national distinction. We see that historical nationalities with their own language distinction, we see separate church even, we see different legal systems that applied in different types of the United Kingdom. So we see that there are differences in terms of constitutional asymmetry, and that Belgium itself is not really something very unique in the European Union, but also not in the world, in Europe continentally, but also if we're talking about the world as such. As I said, I mentioned previously, there's some how do we actually know that this happens? We know that because we know that there are some indicators of constitutional asymmetry, and we talk about when we talk about status, we are talking about the power of subnational entity to define its specific position. And we see it in Belgium, we see it in Spain, we see it in Italy, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we see it in the United Kingdom, just to mention some of the European countries. And here you see the list of sub-indicators in terms of veto powers, in terms of participation in constitution making, and so on. We have the same thing for the distribution of powers and competences in terms of differences in the allocation of powers and competences, whether the powers and competences are increased or decreased when it comes to one or more subnational entities. And finally, fiscal autonomy in terms of revenue raising power, for example, or spending capacity, or the power to raise taxes, and so on. Some of the examples that I can give you is, for example, that in Belgium, the example of the distinct status is that the linguistic divide actually corresponds to subnational entities division, and both of those actually correspond to party ideology. In the sense that there are region-based parties. For example, if we talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina, we talk about the powers and competences. We talk about a very narrow set of exclusive competences at the central level. We also have the so-called parallel competences, which is something completely different. and which are used to impose specific laws by the Office of the High Representative. But we see that there are differences, for example, between slight, but still there are differences between the entities and the district, for example. And then, for example, in terms of fiscal autonomy, we see that in Spain we have fiscal autonomy that has been granted to the Basque Country, and Navarre, for example, exceeds the overall fiscal framework, where Catalonia actually tried unsuccessfully to demand a similar status and, of course, did not make it. So asymmetry is actually something that is very much, very much there, and it is used as a form of multinational conflict management. But at the same time, we also know that it can undermine the equality, transparency, cohesion, and hence it can actually endanger the legitimacy and stability of the system. It provides grounds for the stability of the system because, as we see, for example, in the states such as Belgium or Spain or Italy, it provides for a softer response. So differences granting specific status or specific powers and competences or fiscal autonomy to a specific region, to a specific subnational entity actually provides for a softer response to differences in identity. So it's a kind of, we call it a tailor-made accommodation of diversity. It's also very flexible because it can be used in institutional design processes. And sometimes it is a successive sort of. It also enables the power to choose in a sense that it is there for subnational entities, but also for the central level to choose what to enforce and what not to enforce in terms of the three indicators that I mentioned. And it should theoretically, and we've seen it so far also practically, that it prevents a system from falling apart. So from some perspective, we can claim that encourages the stability of the system, and it can act as a shock absorber because it is also very complex. And complexity, in theory of complexity, actually acts exactly like that, as a shock absorber. And at the same time, constitutional asymmetries as such, in the way they're applied in Belgium or Bosnia and Herzegovina, actually allow to choose some solution as permanent or sometimes even as transitional. So we can say that it's kind of a tool for accommodation of conflict in states with identity differences which apply federal features. But then at the same time, it might also cause some instabilities because the intensity of the demands that I mentioned at the beginning may be too strong at some point, causing the opposite of stability. We've seen it in Catalonia. It can also be challenging if the distribution of powers and competences has to be regarded, because it requires a lot of coordination, which means that some of the systems may not be apt to do that. And of course, if there's a lot of displeasure which is caused by the constitutional asymmetries from other subnational entities to match the differences, it can also lead to further tensions. So, but yeah, the most important is that it is unresponsive to maximalist and instant demands. So that's something that is not going to happen. Stability, all in all, in those systems such as Belgium, such as Spain or Italy or Bosnia and Herzegovina or the United Kingdom, actually depends on several types of balances within the state. So it depends on how the territory and identity differences that are balanced, so territorially embedded identity, and then horizontal and vertical balances within the system. And then finally, structural and fiscal balances, because it has to be based on instruments and mechanisms that can guarantee the balance. And it has to be positioned in a way that can protect the actual balance. And I'm sorry that I'm not there to be part of the discussion or to answer some of your questions, but thank you for your attention, and hopefully I will see you soon on another occasion.